Good afternoon. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm, and we're delighted to have you joining us today for this Crisis Coach webinar. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that is sponsored and co-written by the RenWeb people. And today we're going to be discussing communication breakdown. It's always the same. Our presenter is Jim Satterfield, President and Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Firestorm. If you want to watch previous webinars in this series, you can go to firestorm.com and you can look for the recorded webinars on our YouTube channel, and you can watch previous webinars, and you can also register for future webinars. We also would like you to become our friend on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. You can follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that the presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion. And this information should be considered and read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm's very thankful and delighted to have RenWeb as our co-sponsor, host, and underwriter of this webinar series. We have today with us Shannon Fernandez. Shannon, do you have any comments you would like to make for us today?
Just thank you for having us, and I want to thank everybody for attending today. We're going to hear some really valuable information, and I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Good. Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks, Shannon.
And,
this is Jim Satterfield. Bill, I'll just jump on in. By the way, we were giving Shannon a hard time today, telling her that she was going to have to do a 40-minute presentation. So if you're attending and you would like Shannon to talk next time for 40 minutes, let us know, and I'm sure she'll be glad to volunteer in that process. We are very excited about working with the independent schools and private schools across the country and actually globally. We've worked with RenWeb schools both in the U.S. and abroad, and it's certainly a great system and allows you to control your operations on a regular basis. And I think that the teaming with Firestorm, where we talk about crisis management and the types of things that you can see happening in your school, it's certainly a reason why we want to do those things. And there's certain programs within the RenWeb software that are extremely useful, and we have pointed those out in previous webinars and will continue to do so through this series. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer and founder of Firestorm, and we're glad to be together, and I look forward to meeting some of you face-to-face at the user conference next year, as we've done in the last several. I think it's a great opportunity for you to experience what it's like in a crisis and see how you make decisions and address the exposures. I know that we are all concerned about activities that are happening in our schools, and in the first quarter of next year, we're going to be doing a virtual test exercise around active shooter. So we'll get you the dates when that's coming out, and I'm sure the RenWeb team will get that information out to you. But it'll be a 90-minute workshop. You can get your emergency crisis team around the table and have a chance to go through looking at making the critical decisions in that type of an environment. Today we want to talk about what crisis communications breakdowns occur and what you need to do. And we always are focused on what are the lessons learned and how can we get better in these particular areas. And one of the things that we found is obviously a great many schools don't have plans around what that messaging should look like in a crisis. And that's where it starts to break down and someone tries to wing it or just come up with an off-the-cuff comment, and obviously that's not going to give the type of results that you're looking to have happen. So the first thing we can tell you from a lessons learned is it is time to sit down and start to think about a crisis communications plan and specifically what the messages are that you want to send to your students, to your teachers, to your parents throughout a crisis. So today we're going to focus on this topic. Specifically, we'll give you some tools that you can use. So what do you do? Where do you start? How does this come together? And the first area that I would think about when I focus on crisis communication is what are the risks that your organization faces? What could happen in our school? We could certainly have weather events, winter storms. We're getting ready for that season, and that can be disruptive. We've got some of our schools in areas where there are tornadoes, or California where there's earthquakes. Flooding has been a problem. We've seen this year in particular in several locations. South Carolina schools have had some unique challenges there that they've not experienced in the past. I know that armed intruder and active shooter is a particular concern, but we've dealt with communicable illness and other types of factors. So where you start is you take that vulnerability risk assessment you've done for your school, or a hazard impact matrix, and look at all of the threats and risks that you have, and then determine what would we say if this was happening. What would we say before it, during it, and after? And when we think about crisis communications, that's what we're going to be addressing. And generally, in thinking about before, during, and after, there are three types of components that we think about our crisis communications. One would be coordination communications, and generally those are internal within our school or to our parents about what they need to do to respond. And it's done at the start of an event. And so that coordination communication is generally the first type of crisis communication that goes out, and that is an extremely critical. It could be lockdown, shelter in place, evacuate. As we look at each of those elements, there are different communications. And then if you're dealing with parents and using some of the notification capabilities that, for example, that are built into the RenWeb software, then you would be wanting to let them know where they could find their child, the reunification process associated with it. So the first type of crisis communication then fits into this area called coordination. The second type of communication would be in the area dealing with that big word in the center of the screen, crisis. It's the brand and reputational impact. And that's external, and it's much more strategic and needs to be thought through. And we're going to talk about that a lot today as we go through this discussion about the lessons learned. And when you think about brand and reputation, it's an external communication, and it will generally come later in the crisis cycle. There's a third component, and that is one of compliance. There are many communications that you're going to be required to give. If you are aware of a child, for example, that maybe is a victim of domestic violence or harm might be coming to that child, then you have a reporting duty, and that's a compliance communication that you would have to get out. Also, you could have other requirements. Cyber breach is a big exposure that's affecting businesses and schools, and you have a great deal of information about your students. It could be behavioral information, it could be health information. You might have financial information on families for their tuition and payments around that. And so if you had a cyber breach and that data was hacked by some outside party, you'd have a notification responsibility around that. By the way, is another opportunity if you'd like to take advantage. There will be in December of this year, on December the 8th and on December the 14th, a cyber breach test exercise. It'll be 90 minutes. It will occur at 2 p.m. Eastern on both of those days, on the 8th of December or December the 14th. You can attend one or the other with your team to go through and experience what it's like to make decisions in a cyber breach crisis that would be affecting you. Now, we've got about 1,000 companies that will be anticipating that day, and we have a great many schools that have also registered, and there is no cost for that, and that might be something that you would find of interest to be involved. So we start then by looking at the crises and exposures that we have had, and making sure that we're ready to talk about those before, during, and after. So why is crisis communication so critical? Why is it different than any other kind of communication? In World War II, there was a phrase that was used greatly called loose lips sink ships. And in a crisis, they do more than just sink ships at this point in time. The idea in World War II is the enemy might be listening, and if you mentioned where a ship was and your loved one was there, they might easily become a target. But your brand and reputation will be determined by the communications that you have in a crisis. You don't want to become known as the school where this awful thing had happened. Now, this year we've responded to a large number of schools in crises. Some of these were violence-oriented, student-on-student violence, and these are private schools, independent schools in that environment. One where a sports team decided they would start to discipline other team members, and some violent actions took place there, and sexual molestation. We've also had several schools where there was pornography on computers, and child pornography is a significant concern. We've had some health outbreaks and several weather-related events that have occurred. So crises happen. It's just not something that's going to happen to someone else. It's going to happen in your school at some point. But see that area where it says stop and ask why right in the center of the slide? What we want you to do, if there's a crisis and you've been tasked with a job of we've got to communicate, we have to be transparent, we have to tell people what's going on, I want you to slow that down within your school and stop and ask why. And I want you to do that 5 times. So when someone comes and says, you know, we need to get this message out, you should stop and say, why? And when they give you an answer, then you should say, why? Because until you've answered that question 5 times, it was probably not appropriate to get that communications out. You've got to know why you're communicating. What is the metric? What do we expect to accomplish by this communication? And if there's any doubt at all, we would recommend that you don't do the communication at that point in time. So understanding that why, establishing it early on, will help us weigh the advantage of the communication versus the potential exposure or liability. And in many cases, you can't communicate the specifics of it. For example, if something happened to a student, you cannot talk about that student to a third party. You cannot give away that information. You may have restrictions under HIPAA. There are personal privacy issues around it. If a question is asked about a teacher, you cannot answer that question directly because of confidentiality issues there. If a question was raised and maybe a teacher had done something inappropriate and there was a problem, and someone says, well, did you do a background check on them before you hired them? You cannot answer that question, yes or no. What you can say is I'm sure you can appreciate, we can't talk about an individual teacher, but what I can share with you is we do background checks on all our teachers before they're hired. Now, one additional comment, just as a reference here, is that background checks are not required just when you hire someone, but in line to standards and best practices, you must do this annually. Annual background checks are critical where anyone has contact with children. So one of the things that you need to be able to do is to stop the process and slow it down when someone says, you know, we've got to get out to our parents and share this communication. Stop and ask them why, and do that repeated 5 times. Just as if you had a small child that came up and they were going to touch the stove and you told them, no, don't. The child might say, why? And you'd have to go, because it's on. Why? Because we're getting ready to cook dinner. And asking that why, at some point you may well get frustrated with that child, but it will at least let you know what your communication is supposed to be and why you're looking at that. In a crisis, it's extremely critical that you slow the process down and make sure that you're giving the right message to the right person at the right time. So one of the key lessons we've learned then is to look at your risk and exposures, then look at why you're communicating. Now, in order to do that, we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. Look at the events that have occurred or you think may well occur. Predict what that vulnerability and impact would be as a result of that. What do you need to monitor? What's the trigger for you to start to send out those messages and establish that up front? It's much easier to edit than it is to create, and we'll give you some specific communications tools in just a few minutes. But as you think about this, at each step along the way, in the crisis or the disaster, you want to be making these predictive areas. Now, we'll mention briefly today having a predictive, actionable intelligence network, and that's going to be an area that you'll want to increasingly look, because it's a way for you to understand what's being said about your school, what's being said about this event, and what actions do you need to take. Now, the plan here is we're focused at this time in this particular webinar around crisis communications. So who is your spokesperson? Have they had media training? Are they prepared to do it? Do you have 2 backups identified? Are you available to be able to give that support that's needed through each one of those areas? And then finally, the delivery of that, the training of individuals, and having this plan in place with the message maps that are going to be needed. So let's go a little bit deeper into predict, plan, perform. The first thing that we want you to do is to focus on who the audience is. Is the audience your students? Are you a K through 12 independent school, so you've got a lower school, a middle school, and an upper school? Because your communications will vary depending upon the age of the child. Is it the parents? Is it the teachers? Would it be the donors that are supporting the school? Is it the accreditation people that we're concerned about? And so looking at who our audience is goes a long way in helping us focus and look at that. Now, each one of those audiences, each one of those groups of stakeholders has specific concerns. So thinking about them in advance of creating your communications will help you tailor your message to fit directly to them, and that's that plan area. Tailor the message, the messenger, whoever's going to be delivering that, and the media or medium or modality by which you're going to communicate. Is this going to be a conversation? Is it going to be a text message, an email blast? Is it going to be a phone call? Is it an interview? Is this a letter that you've written that you're going to put in the mail? Is it a letter you're going to post on your website? Is it a press release? Is it going to be an appearance at a press conference and talk? How is that going to be dealt with? And you want to tailor those and format it to each stakeholder as we go through the process. So as we look at this, we focus on what our 3 key messages are. And we would talk about home basis, which we're going to go into, and then message maps in just a minute. But your messages are going to have to be concise and simple. People can't remember 100 things. What are the critical 3 messages that you want them to understand as this crisis continues to unfold and occur at each element? So why is this so hard? Why is crisis communications more difficult than any other kind of communication? Well, in a crisis, we see an escalating flow of events. Things are going to be happening very quickly around you. And in most cases, you're going to have insufficient and inaccurate information. We will tell you and remind you at the end of this webinar that in almost every crisis, the initial information you have will be wrong. And so you're going to be forced to make decisions based upon wrong information, both regarding the actions that you're going to take in your school and the communications that you're going to send out. So combining this with looking at why you're going to communicate, if initially what you know is wrong, we want to keep our statements very general, as opposed to saying, we know that this didn't happen, because it later may turn out, in fact, that in fact did occur. And once you say something that is not correct, you lose credibility, and that will impair your ability to continue to function and grow your school the way that you want to. So you're under intense scrutiny. In a crisis, you're going to lose command and control. Others may be directing actions, and again, you have to get those messages out. And how you respond to that crisis can well create a second crisis. So in focusing our communications, we want to be very careful in establishing that, because our brand and our reputation are under attack. This can well define who we are as a school, and in coming years will be referred to as the school where X happened. And that's an element that we want us to become increasingly aware of. Now, don't lose sight, if you're thinking about your communications and planning your messages, that every crisis is a human crisis. That's someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's mother, or someone's father. And so as they're going to be focused on this at a personal level, they're going to be concerned about, is my child safe? What happened? Why didn't you have this under better control? What's going on in those particular areas? And so we're going to see in many cases an emotional response, and then later we'll even share about rumors that could easily come together. If we're silent, if we don't communicate at all, that may be associated with the fact that we've done something wrong, that there's guilt on our part. And so obviously we're going to communicate, but it's a function of when and what are we going to say. We are not going to make statements saying no comment, because again, that's generally associated with the fact that perhaps you've done something wrong. As we think through each of these areas, we'll go into more depth. But look at the last word, it's surprise. The last time a surprise was good for me, I was 5, and it was my birthday. If you're at school and there's a crisis and it comes as a surprise, which it will, this is going to be a negative area that you're going to be forced to deal with and respond to. So what's the process? How are we going to work through and develop our crisis communications? First, we've got to assess the situation and determine whether a communications is warranted now or ever. There will be some times when we will not communicate about a particular event, but clearly we can't communicate until we have all the facts. And we'll give you some tools that will help bridge that gap so that you don't have to say no comment or you don't have to deny an action. We will speak the truth at every step along the way. So first, you would want to identify who the key audiences are. Who are we needing to talk to? If you had a problem that occurred on a sports team, is it just the team members? Is it the family of those students on the team? If it was happening in a particular grade, do you talk to other grades? Is this the public that we're dealing with? Is this just a school-only matter, as we're going to identify there? We want to align our message maps. These are pre-written messages to the key audiences. So as we will talk more about that, but we'll look at the threats and risk. And so let's assume that our school is in an area that might flood. Well, then what if there was a flood? Then we could go on and plan what our messages would be in advance to say, if we're experiencing this, here's the first message, the second or third that we would give out. We clearly think about that in terms of winter storms and school closures, or if there was a violence episode, we could plan for what our messages would be in advance and then edit them as we need to. We've got to monitor the facts about the events. Again, since much of what we're going to hear initially is wrong in that report, what are others saying? What's going on at this point in time? Because our communications will need to address those facts that are coming up. And today, when people hear about events, they're commenting on them, and they're commenting on social media. So you need to create a predictive intelligence network to listen and look at what's being said so that you can focus your messages exactly where they need to be throughout this particular crisis. Now, you're going to communicate to those stakeholders as required, and that's as you require and through that area. We certainly want to work to minimize rumors, and you're going to be amazed at what comes out and would be talked about at that point in time within your school, and it will be outlandish within those statements that are starting to come. But if you're unaware of it, then a great deal of damage would come about to your brand and reputation. So identifying those early and responding will become extremely critical. Obviously, debrief regularly during a crisis event. What's working, what's not working, what are new facts, what are the changes that we need to be focused on in those particular areas. And ask for assistance if you need it. If you're going to bring in a crisis manager, we recommend that come in through your legal counsel, whoever the general counsel or the external counsel is for your school. that's to establish a potential attorney-client confidentiality. But having someone that's an expert in crisis public relations would certainly help, and that's a little different than normal PR, where you're out trying to build your brand and share the information. We think a little differently when we're in one of these situations. And specifically, we want you to verify that whatever you're about to say supports the brand position of your school and where you will fall. I know we've all been following the events out of Missouri that have been happening there with the University of Missouri over the last several weeks. The charges of racism, the termination, the resignation of the president in that particular environment. We can see how an event can suddenly escalate and create a significant impact for everyone that's involved. So we've talked a lot about some of the background and framing. How do we know when we're supposed to communicate? And that's a very hard issue to think through. We recommend that you create an event activation matrix and look at the types of things that would occur and then break them into three categories. A minor event that's a very low impact, an incident, it could be significant and adverse, but it still is limited. It's not everything about the school. It's limited to a particular area. And then finally, something that's a business crisis, something that would affect your entire school, your entire enterprise, and focused on it. So as you go through, you would make a list of what those types of events would be, the actions that you would see that would need to be taken, what kind of message would you want to give out, who's responsible for that, and the crisis management team that would be assembled around it. Because obviously if we're dealing with a behavioral of concern, a behavior of concern, that might be a different team than someone who might be responding to a severe winter storm. So you can certainly blend your teams, and you would establish, here's what we're going to monitor, here's the messages we would do, and here's the specific trigger. This is the point at which we're going to specifically communicate. If you haven't created such an event activation matrix, let us know. We would certainly be glad to speak with you about that and help and do that through the process. Now, when we think about communications, there's a cycle that goes through. And while this chart says the communication cycle, we could easily have labeled this as the crisis communication cycle. But in the headline of the slide, it talks about communication cycle dash control. And controlling the message here, controlling the communications, are going to be extremely critical in a crisis. Now, if you have the opportunity, like now you don't have a crisis going on, that's your opportunity to do your information gathering. What are the exposures that we're concerned about? What kinds of communications would we make from a coordination standpoint, from a crisis standpoint, from a compliance standpoint for each one of the vulnerabilities and threats that we've seen? If you're in an actual crisis and you're trying to do this on the fly at that time, then we've got to gather as much information about that particular crisis, and then we'd start to draft our messages and edit them. It is always easier to edit than it is to create. So planning in advance, starting to review, and then doing the updates will make it easier. All of the details because of privacy issues, because of liability issues that are involved in it. Now, even if you've done all the message mapping and planning that's been appropriate, I don't want you to hit the send button until you've gotten approval that now is the time for that message to go out. So your crisis management team or your head of school would need to be involved in that decision that now is the time to release that information. I would encourage you, don't just send a message to send a message. Now, once we've cleared that, then we can go into distribution. As you know, there is a notification capability as an option on the RenWeb platform, but this might be just calling the parents that are involved. You need to be very careful here with this messaging to make sure you've got the right format. If you send anything out in writing, it will have a life of its own and can be shared repeatedly. So if there's a limited problem, a limited crisis, you want to deal orally directly with the people that you must communicate with. If we have a message that needs to go out to a much broader audience, all of the families and parents that are represented in the school, you might consider drafting that and posting it on your website and directing people to the message there. Therefore, there can be no miscommunication. If this event is so material that the media is involved in your area, then they can go to that website, pull that, quote it as it is there, not just a soundbite from an interview. So we're much better off in that situation with the message posted on our website. You would then manage inquiries, make sure you're getting the response. You would do this external monitoring. What's the sentiment and tone of the response? What are the rumors? What do we need to do? Is our message getting out? We recently got involved with an organization that had to issue a crisis, an apology in a crisis, and we did the monitoring, and we found that over 200 media outlets, including major television networks, major print, had picked up their apology, and that was a great help to be able to know that we did get that circulation out within the process. So when we talk about predictive intelligence, and we've done a series of webinars on that topic, and that's one you might want to go back and listen to. And again, there is no charge for those in order to be able to listen to those pre-recorded webinars. They deal with this, and today it's the monitoring of merged media, social and traditional media. There are multiple tools out there. Firestorm utilizes a tool to listen and then a separate tool to look. And when we listen, we're looking for specific phrases and streams and keywords and issues and see how they occur. Now, we want to establish a baseline so that we can see there's a level of communications at a certain amount, but suddenly if we see that escalate, we know something's going on. We know there's a problem and an issue there. And so what that helps us become aware of what we need to do and what we need to say. It is extremely critical that you have an intelligence network established that monitors what's going on. This will give you a great deal of insight, and in many cases, you may even be able to prevent the crisis because you learned of it earlier. You clearly will then be able to identify rumors and misinformation, even emerging attacks. The statistics here are very startling. If someone has ill intent, 80% of the time an additional person knows, and 67% of the time 2 or more people know. And when people know, they talk. And where do they talk today? They talk on social media. So this can make a difference. You also will want to have some type of an anonymous reporting system so that you get those information and then feed back the results of your intelligence work back to your crisis team and your head of school, and that will help direct actions. So home bases, that's the first type of thing that you can start to design. Those are well thought out statements that are safe that you can go back. So just like when we were in school and we played dodgeball, and if you were on base you couldn't be hit, these are bases that you go to. It's a safeguard so that if you're asked a question and you're not prepared, you have something that you can say other than no comment. It empowers you to answer those in a way that prevents your answer from creating this second crisis that we're concerned about. And we generally develop those when you're developing your crisis communications plan and your message maps or even your media training. And it's things that you can begin to work on right now. And as we look at those, at Virginia Tech, Firestorm did the crisis management at Virginia Tech 8 years ago, and that was the largest episode of workplace violence in United States history. We helped them focus on 3 specific messages, and I'm going to repeat these multiple times between now and the end of the webinar, that will not be defined by the event, that will invent the future and will embrace the family. Those 3 messages can be used in almost every crisis that you will find. You'll customize them to the types of events. So I would ask you, what does define your school? Look on your web page. What's your mission statement? What are you doing? Are we providing an education environment? We're working on the athletic aspects. We're providing moral training. We're providing good citizenship. What's defining our school? And that whatever the bad thing happened is, doesn't define you. It's these other higher levels. And you're not going to talk about the details around the crisis. You're going to talk about what you're going to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again. The new policies and procedures that you put in place. And lastly, that you're going to embrace the families, because that's the focus and who your community is involved. Message maps are the next step in this, and they're the more detailed to the specific questions that you could see that would be asked to help you lead through that formula of, if they ask this question, what's the first thing I'm going to say, the second thing, and the third. So you identify what you want the targeted audience to know related to that question. You identify what you need to do to correct those misperceptions or erroneous information. You prepare the 3 key messages at each step, and by the way, in the delivery, when you're asked that question, you give the first answer and then you're quiet. If they ask a follow-up, you give the second and then you're quiet. When they ask the third question on that same subject, you give the third answer and then you're quiet. If another question comes, you return back to your home bases and give those areas. So stop now and think about what's defining your school. What is your mission statement? What are your core values? And you would talk about that this event, whatever bad thing that happened, isn't who your school is and what you do. Then I want you to be able to talk about what you're going to put in place to make sure it won't happen again. And then finally, that you're reaching out. Keep your messages short. You can't talk a page or a paragraph on this. Generally, a message is a sentence, at most 2 sentences, so that you can be clear and it can simply come through. Documenting these in writing in advance of need helps. But if you can't, you're going to be developing them, but write them out. And there will be some difference in the message if it's said orally or said in writing and how it would be dealt with. Now, as you do exercises and talk about what would we do if a tornado hit our school or if we had an episode of violence, I want you to then practice at the same time the delivery of what those communications would be and the medium in which you're going to do that, so that the first time you deal with it is not in the middle of a crisis. That becomes extremely critical to have that practice in place. Now, when we talked about message maps, here's a template to begin to think about. What's the question of concern? What's the impact that would come as a result of that? Who is the stakeholder? Now, I could see taking that question and saying, here's what we would say to a student. Here's what we would say to a parent. Here's what we would say to a teacher associated with it. And have my first, second, and third message, as we described earlier, and the medium by which you're going to deliver it. You should stop and look at your vulnerability and threat assessment or your risk assessment for your school or your hazard impact matrix or your all hazards approach. And for every one of those that you've identified, sit down and start to think now about what are those messages if in fact that we're going to have to speak on that particular subject. To plan it in advance makes it much easier to edit at the time of need, so you're not having to go back to square one and start this process over and over. Now, we've said this a couple of times, and I want to come back and reiterate it once again. In a crisis, almost everything you learn in the first 24 hours is wrong. You're going to be forced to make decisions based upon wrong information. You're going to be forced to do some communications in the face of wrong information. That's why we're not going to stand up and give all of the details initially. In many cases, we may never be able to give all of the details. If a student is alleging sexual molestation, we can't name the student. We can't give the details of this. That will be an incorrect step for us. If the police are involved and there's an incident that's occurred and someone has questions, you can direct them back to the police for those details because they would be conducting that investigation, or the fire department in the light of the others. But we will be prepared to talk about that this won't define us as a school, that we're going to invent the future to put policies and procedures in place so it won't happen again. But our real focus is to those that were involved, and that's where our hearts and our interests are. Planning in those types of areas will make a significant difference in the perceptions that come in. Because in the following years, it's about the consequences of your communication. Are you going to be known as the school where this occurred? That will be one of the key areas to look at. And so establishing the metrics, evaluating, is our message getting out? Are we monitoring so that we can see that our words and our phrases are in fact the ones that are being used when people talk about this particular event becomes the standard by which we will all be measured. So I showed you a slide and ask why. I want to emphasize this is one of the most important things for you to focus on. It's not that we have a no media strategy or a no communication strategy. We have a why media and a why communicate strategy. And in almost every single case, you can communicate directly to your stakeholders, to your students, your parents, and your teachers without going through the media to have that conversation. You've got to look at your school community and know who you want to talk to and get that message out. Who are our brand advocates? Who are our brand detractors? And to carry that forward. If someone doesn't like you, if someone hates you, they're not going to listen to what you have to say. Words will not make those events go away. But establishing why we're going to communicate and why we're communicating at this time will be one of the smartest moves that you can make and will help your leadership team deal and manage with this crisis. Because if we are just talking to talk, that's going to probably increase seen that in the events at the University of Missouri over the last few weeks, as it has not moved to de-escalate those events, but in fact to accelerate them greatly. So what's next? Do you want to know what's going to happen tomorrow? Then you need to be planning and preparing for that. Looking at your vulnerability and risk assessment, setting up your intelligence network, because you can't afford not to know. You can't afford to be caught by surprise in those particular areas. I'd recommend that you participate in an exercise, either a tabletop exercise, or if you want to participate in the cyber breach exercise coming up on December the 8th or December the 14th, just go to the Firestorm website. You can sign up. There is no charge for that, and it'll be a 90-minute event that you can experience what it's like to make decisions in a cyber breach, the business impacts on your school. And then next quarter, we're going to do, after the first of the year, an active shooter virtual exercise. And I would encourage you to get both your incident and crisis teams together, or your emergency teams, as well as you focusing on the crisis communications there. If you want to see if your plans align to standards and best practices, since you're a RenWeb user, you can have your plans assessed at no cost. I would encourage you to begin designing your own intelligence network. If you need assistance, we can do that. I also would encourage you to start thinking about making sure that your plans are on your smartphones. Therefore, the palm of the hand of the teacher will be your plan, so it won't be a binder or a flip book. It's going to become much more active in that level. And then finally, if you need additional training, please give us a call and we'll work on that. What's next? You can download the brief talking about communications breakdown today, and you can see what's going to happen and get some of these points that you can share with others within your school. Our thanks today go out to RenWeb for underwriting and sponsoring this webinar series. This is the 11th in the series, and we're excited that you were able to join us today and become a part of it. Shannon, I don't know if you want to have any closing words, but if you do, now's a good time to jump in and provide those insights to us.
Okay, well, that was a great webinar, and on behalf of our clients, thank you for the important information you've shared with us. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, please keep an eye out on your email for next month's webinar invitation.
All right, and we'll be talking about some of the lessons learned this year from the crises that we've seen. If you have questions, you can go to the firestorm.com website and fill out a contact form, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. I wish you a great Thanksgiving and a very happy fellowship with your family and friends at this time. Thank you for all that you're doing with our young people every day in schools around the globe. Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone. Until next month, this is Jim Satterfield. Have a great day. Goodbye.